The definition of diversity may be as diverse as the term itself. For me, diversity is simply the simultaneous existence of 7 billion different realities. In other words, there are as many realities as there are people on this planet. Now, understanding, respecting, and ultimately celebrating this diversity may not be so simple. First of all, it calls for a vision on how to make it possible for all these different realities to coexist in peace. Second, it requires a set of actions in order to implement that vision. On the Hello Mahalo vlog series, we will be speaking to people from all over the world who have taken that step to transform their vision into action. We hope to inspire you. So joining us today is teacher, researcher, and educational activist Tim Bedford. It is very, very nice to have you here with us today, Mr. Bedford.
Nice to be here. Yes.
So, school is a word that I believe for most people, it doesn't necessarily evoke the best of memories. And I think that this early negative experience may end up turning people completely off of the learning process, which is unfortunate, of course. Why don't you share with us a little bit about your approach to teaching?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I agree with what you said. The problem is that schools were set up on industrial lines, pretty much how we organised factories, and the idea was to put kids into school at an early age, and they could turn out at say 15, 16, and they would then be ready to go into the workforce. So schools have always been seen very much as an economic thing, as helping to secure this paradigm of economic growth and so on. So putting people inside one room for 8 or 9 hours a day, I don't think is really my idea of what schools should be. Schools often are structured around a particular teaching approach, which is students sit there 75 minutes after 75 minutes each lesson after each lesson, and listen to what the teacher has to say, sitting there as empty vessels, and have to passively absorb this knowledge, and then maybe at the end of the week there's a test to see how well they're paying attention. So to me, schools, above all things, and this is borne out by, for example, educationists like Ken Robinson, they destroy creativity completely. They don't allow for spontaneity. They don't allow for a diversity of approaches to learning. They pay little attention to the diversity of learners and what learners want to learn. So, in my view, I don't have a very positive view of schools, but I work in a school system, and I try to bring something a bit new. But even that sometimes doesn't work because students have been programmed to think of teacher and student in a particular way. And when I want students to construct knowledge, to come up with ideas, to question knowledge, it can often be an alien thing for them because they've been brought up to the idea that the teacher knows everything. The teacher is the sage on the stage, and therefore, what on earth is this teacher doing, asking us for coming up with answers and things that he can't know very much. Can't be a very good person. He can't be very knowledgeable, and all these kind of things. So to try and break the mold is very, very difficult. And the more I spend in education, the more anti-education I am on a large scale, particularly as education is now very much geared towards turning out not only good workers, but good consumers.
You mentioned how, of course, obviously, a teacher is immersed within the educational system and students already have a certain expectation. But what can you try to do as a teacher in order to change the learning process a little bit and perhaps awaken something in students?
In terms of teaching approach, then critical pedagogy is the way to go, which is teaching and learning for personal and social transformation. Because at the end of the day, what I want students to be is to be critical thinkers, to not just passively absorb all and everything that they learn, but to criticize that and to be able to justify the different opinions and values they have. Not only that, they gain a critical awareness, for example, of issues, particularly in economics that I teach. They raise a critical awareness of the injustices of the economic system that we live in. And I hope that that then translates into sort of a critical action, that they carry that into their lives, that they can then be active in trying to bring about a bit of a change in their lives. As I say, it doesn't always work. Many of my students end up as investment bankers and parasites like investment bankers, or they end up in the World Bank. So in many ways, I'm a complete failure.
Anyway, the focus of your doctorate research was the empowerment of teachers,
Yes,
specifically to promote GLBTQ equity in schools.
yes.
What kind of impact can a teacher hope or expect to have when it comes to particularly promoting greater respect for diversity in the classroom?
Yeah. Well, I think I pay a lot of attention to the things I say around diversity, and I take opportunities to interrupt heteronormativity by throwing in things where they're relevant. If, for examples of racism or sexism or so on. So I think it's very important that, of course, the teacher in what they do is and what they say is very important, and that impacts the students. I always think, like, every year, if one student does something different or has a different approach or goes out and becomes sort of some kind of activist or whatever, then I think that's quite good, really. Yeah.
So I understand you will be speaking at a conference in Riga next week. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit what this conference is about?
It's really to do with ecology and the ecological aspects and the sustainable development goals, the 2030 agenda. And my contribution to that is to take the limits to growth and can they be seen in the SDGs? So you're probably familiar with the book. Are you familiar with the book Limits to Growth? It came out in 1972. Very much for the first time, someone said, we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. So one part of my presentation is to do with looking at the limits to growth, which of course includes using like the ecological footprint. So in my presentation, I talk about how every international institution is just locked into a growth paradigm. All of their policies are, and then I take bit by bit all the things from the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's mentioned 17 times economic growth is the goal, is the goal, is the goal. So they're nonsense. They're not worth anything. I mean, they don't respect limits. So I also mentioned UNESCO, which has this big policy of education and education for sustainable development. But once again, I took their latest document, and throughout of it, it's just littered with the importance of education for economic growth, education for economic growth. So there's very little hope, really. Certainly those in positions of power benefit from this idea, and it's to do with money and stuff like this, because I can't see these being turned around. But why on earth have intelligent people sat down there and done these things when there's just a basic idea you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet? What don't they understand about that?
Even I understand that, and I was a
Yeah,
pretty
even you.
lousy math student. Another more positive, let's say, project that you have been involved with has to do with gross national happiness, the project in Bhutan. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, part of it links to what you said earlier about what can we do in schools, because the idea there was to get together a group of teachers from 7 schools in Paro in Bhutan and get them together. And what we did was we discussed how can we promote happiness in schools? How would we change our schools to promote happiness? And how would we change schools to promote happiness in the broader society? So that's what we did, and they all did different projects related to this. And some of it was the basics, like on sustainability things like recycling and so on. But many were just things like making the classrooms look nicer and having flowers and creating gardens and loads of things like this, really. So it was really moving to go back after the time that we did the workshop. Because of course, in 1972, Bhutan abandoned this idea of gross domestic product. It abandoned GDP to pursue gross national happiness in 1972. But looking at the present state of it, though, I'm not sure because it's now attracting global attention from many organizations. IMF, World Bank ignored Bhutan because it's a very small country anyway. I mean, why bother with it? And now it's got the highest growth rate in the world. So they're all very excited, not because it did well on GNH, because it's got high growth. And do you know where that high growth comes from?
Where?
It's
From happiness?
no, it doesn't. No, it comes from developing hydroelectric power, selling it to India, and the ecological destruction from this um, hydro, hydroelectric power is absolutely disgusting. It's destroyed ecosystems, and so now is a country pursuing gross national happiness, but actually is planning to expand even more these hydroelectric dams. And who finances all these dams? Institutions like the World Bank. I'll give you another example of this GDP. Back in 2007, I went to the Parliament in the European Parliament in Brussels. The conference was called Beyond GDP, and there's some fantastic speeches. There's a website from the Club of Rome people. Then I went back to the follow-up in 2011, the conference, and I put up my hand after the first day and said, it was a follow-up to Beyond GDP. I put up my hand and said, will there be any Beyond GDP conference content in this conference? Or they got angry, the OECD, the whole lot, and they said it was never meant to be beyond GDP, it's complementing GDP and all this kind of thing. So there was no Club of Rome people in there who would have swung it in the other direction. They completely hijacked the whole thing. And the people that were presenting had received funds from the EU because they were complementing GDP rather than going beyond GDP. All these new things for growth, like sustainable growth, sustained growth, low carbon growth, smart growth, they just dress it up in all these other names, but it's growth at the end of the day.
I've been really drawn to something that's being called the minimalist movement, and people living in tiny homes, or people just getting down to the basics in terms of what they need. And I think that there's a way there. To me, that gives me hope in the sense that it is something that is not up to the policymakers. It doesn't go through the people who actually make money from getting into our heads that we can have infinite growth. I think that kind of movement gives me hope.
And the other thing too is that having more stuff doesn't make people happier. Beyond a certain level of income, there's no correlation between countries which have low incomes and high incomes in terms of happiness levels. So this is one direction to go in, is happiness and well-being, to focus on these, because a lot of those are not material things.
So earlier we were having you were talking about how you actually didn't necessarily have one particular teacher who had a transformative impact in your life. So I just wanted to share with viewers that Tim Bedford, you, were actually one such teacher for me. So, bringing in petitions, introducing us to causes, getting us to sign stuff, human rights, the environment, getting us to watch life transforming documentaries. So, first of all, I really wanted to thank all teachers, all good teachers, because in my view, you really do have um, the power to transform your students' lives and to have an impact that is everlasting. I want to thank you for how you helped me shape my vision of the world, and I absolutely mean it. And to thank you specifically for being here with us also on the show today and sharing so much of your knowledge and the experience that you bring.
Very good. Yeah. Okay, nice to talk to you.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and visit us on www.hellomahalo.com. Thank you.